It's a pleasure to be here. I've known Professor Taylor for quite a number of years, since he was a rising star at Transportation Research Board meetings, where I first met him in Washington annual meetings, and Professor Manville, who I met as we were both on the Transportation Research Board Committee on Emerging Mobility Systems, which first met a couple of years ago. It's great to be here. I've been to LA many times. It's actually the first time I've walked through the campus of UCLA. I didn't know it was hilly. That was interesting, although I went to one of the hilliest schools, and the public policy school is at the top of the hill at UC Berkeley, so even hillier there. And it was great to see students. I took a walk this morning. It was great to see students out at 7:30 this morning going to classes. I was impressed by that. And I was impressed by everyone waiting for the light to turn on Gailey Avenue as I kind of looped around, even though all the cars. I was ready to go, but everybody was waiting for the light, so I waited too.
Waiting room.
I'd hate to, I was thinking to myself, like, there's certain things, like, if I get injured doing this, so it goes. But if I get injured crossing the street while everyone else is waiting at UCLA, I think it would be really embarrassing, even though I might be in a condition not to really care. The subject today, really I got into 2 years ago, a little bit more than 2 years ago, when I joined this committee that Professor Taylor chaired of the Transportation Research Board. I had been working, as he mentioned, at New York City DOT for 7 years, so I was very into issues of street design, BRT, walking and biking, and I dealt a little bit with car share and bike share. But when I went to the first meeting, I had actually never heard the word Transportation Network Company, TNC. It was entirely new to me. And actually, I wanted to ask you, when you started this class, how many people knew that word, TNC, that term, when you came in? I'm just curious. It's about half, roughly. So I got to the first meeting, which was up in Irvine, and members of the committee were talking about Uber and how great Uber was, that they came and picked you up and took you where you wanted to go, and you paid a fare, and how smoothly it all ran. Very admiring. And I thought to myself, I think I've seen this movie before. I've been involved in cab regulation for 20 years, and what you're talking about sounds like just a very good version of curb-to-curb exclusive ride trips in exchange for a fare. What's so, it sounds great, but what's so different, what's so new about this? And they said, they looked at me like they were appalled. They were like, it's transformative. It's a revolution in transportation. And I was like, okay, well, let's see what's really new about it. Like, if we're going to talk about it, and if we're going to make policy about it, and talk about what the government role should be, which is what I will be talking about this morning. See how worked up you can get about these things. It's good to know, like, what's truly new about it, what's maybe not so new, and you can learn some lessons from in this case, the taxi industry, and how it's affecting cities in new ways, and just sort of maybe the same thing but different. Kind of sort that out, cut through some of the hype, and figure out what's really going on here. So I'm going to talk today about what TNCs are, how they're the same and how they're different, what we can learn from the experience of taxi regulation, much of which you've heard in a previous lecture, right? So I won't repeat much of that, but I'll allude to some of it. And then I'll talk about what I think public policy, how public policy should address the issues both from a regulatory and a standing perspective, regulatory and planning perspective, that have arisen with the rise of Uber and Lyft and other of these emerging mobility services. Now, and I'll go through briefly recommendations that I made in a report that I released a couple of weeks ago, and we can talk about those. Now, how many people are following the baseball playoffs? The Dodgers are still in it. I'm a Cleveland Indians fan. I grew up near Cleveland, and they're still in it, amazingly enough. Shows what you can do without starting pitching. So the sort of, I want to organize my talk around three themes that come from comments by Yogi Berra, who many of you may have heard of. He was a longtime Yankee player, a Hall of Famer, manager of the Mets and the Yankees, but really most famous at this point for some of the things that he said. So there's three things that he said that I think of when I was preparing this. First, you can observe a lot just by watching. So before this room is filled with smart people, and it's great, but sometimes it's good just to watch and see. And Professor Shoup, who I meant to mention, I'm very honored to have here today, has really been the master of this as well, is you can learn a lot just by watching. Second, in baseball, you don't know nothing. And I'll talk about things we don't know with respect to TNCs and emerging shared mobility systems. And third, the importance of making decisions in policy. When you do come to a fork in the road, take it. Okay. So it's always good advice. But before I sort of get into what it is part of this, I want to talk a little bit about TNCs as part of the sharing economy. And I know you've talked about it. I think Professor Manville did the talk on that. It's important for a couple of reasons. One is there's a lot of hype about the sharing economy. You sort of want to cut through that. And secondly, the idea of that this is something very different has helped to give the Uber and Lyfts of the world a type of legitimacy and pizzazz that certainly the taxi industry has lacked for a whole host of reasons. And so you sort of want to know, well, are they really part of the sharing economy? In what ways are they or are they not? Oh, that was my slide for that. I like that. I borrowed that picture. So there's a piece in Fast Company last year that was sort of what I think is much the original vision of what the shared economy is. And I'll just run through these 5 things that Rachel Hotzman highlighted just last year, so this is not going way back. First, the core idea is to put into play unused or underutilized assets. And that's certainly, there's a big piece of TNC for doing that. The company should have a clear values-driven mission and principles, including transparency, humaneness, and authenticity. You see what the sort of values that she's got here. And the providers, in this case the drivers, should be valued, respected, empowered, and their lives should be made economically and socially better. The customers should be benefiting because of the efficiencies involved of using this sort of shift from ownership to access. And then the business should be built on distributed marketplaces of decentralized networks that create a sense of belonging, collective accountability, and mutual benefits. So that's at least one person's vision of the shared economy. And I think much of the specifics you can probably argue, but the gist of that comes through pretty clearly. In actuality, when we think about this particular piece of the shared economy, thinking of TNCs, they certainly have decentralized networks, and it's essential in minimizing their cost structure. And they use assets that mainly sit. Cars sit, 95% of the time. Being tech-enabled is certainly a big piece of their business plan, essential, key to how they operate. Big data, cloud storage, social media, mobile devices, and GPS, and building platforms for participation that organize and simplify the work of collaborating peers, and the technology makes it scalable in a way that traditional companies never were. So you end up with this highly scalable structure with the lower cost structure, small capital investment by the companies, but at core, it's still a commercial transaction. This is not a neighborly over the fence, I'll do you a favor, you'll do me a favor. But it's still, the customers get more convenience at a lower price, and I don't think any of this would have taken off if that weren't the case. And the providers, meaning in this case drivers, have opportunities for part-time work, for working when they want. I took an Uber from LAX last night, and the driver said, you know, we had a long, interesting conversation, and he said, it's just the best thing because you get to work whenever you want and make money. But from that sort of original vision, what's not so important are some of the values, particularly with respect to people who are driving vehicles. Although I think Lyft emphasizes these more somewhat, both in terms of drivers and in terms of shared vehicle use and filling empty seats. There is a lot of peer-to-peer elements in the feedback mechanisms, for example, but it's not really a peer-to-peer network primarily. It's still through a central node, and there are assurances, just as eBay went from being peer-to-peer to something that there's much more of a quality assurance. Airbnb, I would say the same thing. Much more of a quality assurance from the company, the Uber, the Lyft, the Airbnb, and eBay, than purely peer-to-peer. Craigslist, I would say, is pretty much peer-to-peer, and these are not. And there are social aspects, but it's certainly nothing like Facebook. So what is new? What is transformative? When you kind of cut through all of this, what would I say is new and transformative about TNCs? Well, for the users and for the people on the committee who were introducing me to their enthusiasm, I think what's transformative is that the services have this feeling of being always there. That you have the app, wherever you go in the country, you can use the app, and the services is virtually always available. And you don't have to sort out which taxi company you want to call and that kind of thing. And you don't have to worry so much about whether they'll show up at all or show up when they say they will. The app introduces a transparency. You can see what the estimated wait time is before you request the ride. You can see where the vehicle is as they come to you. It's a huge change from the uncertainty that was involved in calling a dispatcher and waiting for a cab. There may be efficiencies that have real societal benefits as well, particularly as these services get into more the Uber commute type of services or the shared ride, and ultimately some types of microtransit. The concept of filling empty seats of people in vehicles, not driving their own vehicle, but in a vehicle that's already making the trip. And they're certainly transformative in terms of disrupting competing services, the taxi business in particular, and offering drivers both opportunities to work when and for how long they want, but it also may translate into job insecurity and further erode the social compact in ways that are very important both for the industry involved and the drivers involved and for the society at large. This is obviously a theme that runs through many of the economic changes the country is undergoing. Next, as I've called this plug and play for self-driving or autonomous vehicles, the evolution of these services toward shared rides, toward larger vehicles, which has begun and is seen most in cities like San Francisco currently, sets the infrastructure and the user habits in place for the introduction of autonomous vehicles, which would then be at a much lower price because you don't have sort of the cost of the driver's time. And you can see this mad rush currently among not only TNCs, but auto manufacturers, companies like Google, considering getting into this. Tesla is another one, because they all realize they could well be left behind. And if you're left behind in what would be a true revolution, it's not going to work out well for you. And then there's a political aspect to what's transformative too. And I came upon this quote, which I think nicely summarizes new businesses that use a halo of positive branding to avoid the discussion of what regulatory structures need to be modernized to deal with these platforms. So it's put in a little bit flat language, I think. But the point is that if you think this is the sexy new thing in town, maybe from a regulatory and a legislative standpoint, you kind of let us do our thing, right? And I think a close look needs to be taken from a public policy and regulatory and planning standpoint so that these companies are brought in to be a very constructive part of the transportation network in a way that also pays attention to other social and economic issues as well, as I'll talk about. So the challenges for public, speaking of which, the challenges for public policy, public safety, and I'll just run through these and then we'll be talking about them. Traffic congestion, a level playing field between TNCs and taxicabs. There are many, many more regulations, as Professor Taylor talked about, on taxicabs than there are on TNCs. They have grown up historically, some for good reason, some perhaps not for such good reason. And the taxi industry has been crying very loudly and with good reason for a so-called level playing field, a consistency, if not sameness between the regulations that apply to them and that apply to TNCs. Equity for drivers and in terms of people who may not have smartphones or access to bank accounts and the like and can't currently use these services. Access, particularly for people with who use wheelchairs, and for underserved communities, although there is evidence certainly that Uber and Lyft serve traditionally underserved communities better than taxi cabs, it's still an issue that needs to be paid close attention to. And effective regulation, which is really much of my focus, whether it be at the state or local level, which has been an issue in the big states, including California. And then, again, as I said before, setting the table for fleets that would field for-hire self-driving vehicles. And on some of these, I think we know a lot, and we can talk very intelligently about what the policy should be. And on some of these, like kind of paving the way for autonomous vehicles, we're very much in the early stages of trying to figure out what that policy should look like. So although there is much new about TNCs, there is also much that is sort of a new improved version of something we've seen for many years with taxi service. And so there's much to learn from taxi and sedan regulation as we think about public policy for this whole group of for-hire vehicles. The first thing is something that I've emphasized a lot is that taxi ridership and the taxi industry was growing quite robustly before Uber and Lyft came along, or Sidecar and the others in about 2012. So you see in the 2000s and early 2010, 2011 period, measured by the number of drivers, and there's different indicators here. This is one that at least is consistent through time. Census data on the number of drivers for whom driving taxi or sedan is their primary occupation was growing 2 and 3% a year over the past 15 years or so prior to the TNCs coming. So there's a segment, there's a market segment that was growing and actually quite rapidly and quite remarkably, given that there was much potential for faster growth. And I worked in a number of cities around the country in the 2000s. And we asked survey questions about the quality of taxi service and whether you would use taxis more if the problems that you've identified as we talked through the survey questions were solved. And so these are surveys I and others did in San Francisco, which had among the worst taxi service in the country, probably San Francisco and Boston. But 44% would use cabs more frequently in the 2012 survey if they showed up within 15 minutes of calling and asking. 44%. In San Jose, 26% would increase their use of cabs a lot, and 44% a little, if availability and other aspects of service were improved. These are 2004 surveys that I did in Alexandria, Virginia, just over the river from D.C., 27% increase a lot and 43% a little. And in New York City, in a survey, 62% would use taxis more if they could get them by cell or text. And this was just a few years before TNC started to allow e-hailing. So you saw the potential for growth, and you saw that the key thing to realize that growth was availability and the reliability of a cab showing up in a reasonable amount of time when you call. So those are sort of useful facts. Now I'm going to kind of shift to some of the lessons from a regulatory standpoint. The central lesson, if there's one most important thing from 100 years of taxi regulation, is that trips that are dispatched need less regulation than flag trips. Street, so by flag I mean trips you get at a taxi stand or by street hail. And the difference is that when you call for a cab, they have a fleet of cabs, a fleet of drivers, and they will work to match supply and demand. So they want enough vehicles and drivers available so they can serve the trips, but not so many as the drivers don't make money. So in any business, you're trying to match supply and demand, and companies on a company-specific basis will seek to do that, number one. And number two, you have a choice of companies. So if you don't like the service at one, you can call another one. And that choice, as in almost any good or service that you might use, has very positive benefits to getting good quality service and responsive and accountable service. When you walk up to a cab at a cab stand or hail one on the street, you just take the next one. It's an undifferentiated mass. And there's no choice, and you can call them information asymmetries and some fancy words, but they're just, you just take the next one regardless. So you don't know enough about them to choose based on quality. There's no feedback mechanism there, number one. And from the driver's perspective, they just show up. There's no control unless there's regulatory control. There's no control on supply. And particularly for the taxi stand service, it's a relatively easy service to provide. And so you get drivers who have relatively limited employment opportunities, and you get too many of them. And so you have an excess of supply, and then you have an incentive to cheat and fare gouge and not pay your insurance and have old, rattly cars and other service problems as well. So the flag trips need controls to prevent oversupply and other abuses. But the dispatch trips, you want to provide for public safety in some basic ways, but you don't need the same kind of entry, fare, and quantity control. And you see this, this is Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, where you get 300 to 500 cabs at a time waiting for trips at the airport cab stand. So to occupy them, there were restrooms, they could play chess, there's internet, surf the internet, play ping pong, while the drivers wait hours and hours. Well, this is obviously, there's no benefit to anyone to have this sort of activity. And in fact, the irony is that all of this is paid for through a surcharge on the fare for passengers leaving the airport. So the customer pays for the ping pong, and I don't think really benefits from it. And you see it in downtowns as well. So that's the number one lesson, is there's a difference in the regulatory needs from flag versus dispatch service. You also need tailored solutions for certain groups of customers, and wheelchair users are the number one example of this. It's a harder population to serve. You need specialized vehicles. It takes longer to load, unload. It takes special driver training. And a number of cities have put forth great efforts to provide wheelchair accessible taxi service. A number of taxi companies have, some pretty well, some not so well, and I'll talk about some of that experience a little bit later. And then you have the issue of regulatory capture. Have you guys talked about regulatory capture at all? Yeah, okay. So we'll come back to that too, but you know what the concept is. So those are things that we know factually or from experience, but just as the Yogi Berra quote suggested, there's also always things you don't know. And one of the really important parts of policy making is, first of all, to recognize what you don't know, And then to think about what risks the unknown create and how do you mitigate those risks. So first of all, you just don't know what's going to happen next. And it's really, really true that in baseball you don't know nothing. And in transportation policy, you come pretty close too. So I use as an example here this U.S. PERG report from April 2012, just as TNCs were starting to come on the scene, that talked about transportation and the new generation, young people and technology. So this was exactly the topic. And what did they say about young people and technology? Communications technology which provide young people with new social networking and recreational possibilities has become a substitute for some car trips. So you don't get in the car to see your friends, you do it electronically. And it makes possible real-time transit data, car sharing, and bike sharing. There's nothing here about what would become TNCs and that type of service at the very birth of these services. So just remember that. It's not to give a knock on this report, but just to remember sometimes what you don't know is like you just don't know. And then I can make a nice list here. So now we do know a lot about this industry, but there's a lot of things we don't know. We don't know if taxi owners and drivers, if given a kind of level playing field, can still compete. Maybe they'll get bought out and new ownership and management will come in and they'll be able to turn it around, or maybe not. Will TNCs address, they've been talking about it, they've been doing a few things, but will they really address the issues of exclusion? What about wheelchair accessible and higher other trips with a higher cost structure? Will one company come to dominate the market? You can imagine who that might be. How exactly does this sort of privatization, if you have shared rides and commute type rides being provided by TNCs, and this sort of melds into this kind of microtransit category, and you add in autonomous vehicles, it starts to look very much like public transportation. And there's some good things about that, and there's some very problematic things you can imagine about that. So this sort of privatization of public transportation, how does that play out? And what might you want to do about that? And finally, you have these big companies that are starting to circle and thinking about getting into this area. So you can envision in all of this a really good end state where you have self-driving vehicles of different sizes, some running routes, some being purely demand responsive, that provide a very rich set of transportation options with much lower congestion, much lower in all electric fleet, much lower emissions, virtually no need for parking, which would revolutionize land use in urban centers. And you can envision that as the end state. And there's been modeling done of that. And one of the things the modeling shows is that you might get on your way there to a very desirable place, you might have some bad mix of what you're dealing with in the middle, the transitional state, both from a service mix and you think about all the planning and political issues, could be very difficult. And so you think about how these evolve, where you are now, where you want to get to, and kind of how do you step through that. So that's kind of the analysis I wanted to talk about. And I went to public policy school at UC Berkeley, and I learned a lot about analysis, and it's sort of my natural, where my head naturally goes. I have two sons, and you should see they're far more analytical than I am, and it's like, whoa. But something I didn't really learn until I was on the job for a while and came to be a more senior person at city agencies, is that in addition to the analysis, there's a moment that I think of as assessment. So analysis is about what do you know, what can you figure out, what can you say with some reasonable certainty and intelligence. Assessment is everything else. Assessment is, well, this person could do this or that. Which do you think they're more likely to do? What are the forces at play here? You play the chess game 2 or 3 steps forward. What's the next move that person is going to do. You have certain risks that you're thinking about. How do you mitigate those risks, and what's the likelihood of that mitigation working out the way you want it to? So the assessment is about thinking, well, how can I make public policy in a way that works towards my objectives, anticipates how stakeholders and institutions will respond. The procurement person says we can get this through in 9 months in front of the agency head. Like, I've never seen a procurement go through in 9 months like this. Like, what do I think? What's my assessment of that? What's my risk strategy for that? How's this all going to come together? And so that assessment I want to talk about in a 2x2 matrix, kind of a SWOT type analysis of strengths and weaknesses of market competition, free markets, market competition, and of regulation. And I think that there is, in the early discussions of the TNCs, a big emphasis on the strengths of market competition and the weaknesses of regulation, much of which I agree with. But it's not a whole picture unless you fill in all 4 cells in the 2x2. So we know pretty well, and those of us who lived through the deregulation of the 70s remember how far the country has come in terms of changing views of how market competition should work in the economy. But certainly the TNCs have been very customer-driven, innovative, brought efficiencies and a great nimbleness. And I think nimbleness is a really important point on this list, that they will, and this helps to have a lot of capital, throw out services and see what works. They give a lot of leeway to their managers at the city or state level to introduce things and try things and then either Photoshop with that or expand it. And it's interesting when you talk to people at Uber headquarters in San Francisco, you say, what are you doing about this or this or this, that? And a lot of times they just don't know because people are doing things around the the debate doesn't necessarily, the information doesn't come back to the person I'm talking to at headquarters. But at the same time, you have the oversupply issues I talked about with taxi service. You can certainly have fly-by-night operators, which you've had in the taxi industry often for many years. They will cherry pick the costs, the trips that are easiest to serve. They're very protective of their data. There's opportunities for market dominance, and there's a lowest common denominator with respect to drivers. On the regulatory and government policy side, much more attention is generally given to equity. You can address externalities, which I know you've talked about. You can have good public involvement, although sometimes it gets to be a lengthy process. And there's an opportunity to connect the dots. So to take this type of service and think about it in the context of transit and auto and street use and all the other things that are important, energy use, emissions, all the other things that are important to having any given transportation service transportation network. On the other side, government agencies often have institutional silos, can be slow and process-oriented. Enforcement is often not very good, and there's issues of regulatory capture. So when I was working on this report that I released a couple of weeks ago that talked about 5 specific issues, which I'll go through, on TNC regulation, these are the things that I was thinking about and kind of weighing, like, okay, I like these parts of this and this part of that, but I got to worry about some things. So I'm trying to match up the strengths from each column here, trying to mitigate weaknesses from one with strengths from another, trying to think about how these will play off against each other, think about what the incentives are for public and private sectors, think about the next steps, and think about then the longer term and what happens. And so that, to me, is kind of how as I think about from a policy development and analytical standpoint, there's this moment of assessment of like, well, what are all the factors here? And some of these are things that in doing this work, one naturally thinks of oneself. In a lot of cases, it's also what you hear and read and what you expect as you enter a public discussion, people will throw at you and raise, and you want to include in the analysis up front. And I think all these things are important, but I would also include in an analysis things that I might not give as much weight to, but stakeholders are giving a lot of weight to. And then kind of sort that through and get to some recommendations. And the other point I wanted to make on this is that it would be a big mistake to think about regulatory policy and planning, transportation planning for Uber and Lyft. You have to think about it in terms of taxis, TNCs, microtransit, the things that they are, the things they may become, and the companies that may enter. So I put up fly-by-night operators not because I think they're fly-by-night operators, although sometimes they've acted more like it than you would think a company their size would, but because you may get fly-by-night operators who come in and who are truly problematic. If you think about fingerprinting, which I'll talk about in a minute, you have to think about what these companies do in terms of driver background checks and what other companies, and there are new companies coming in Texas and Florida in particular, given their regulatory situations, what will they do? And you have to remember that these companies will be competing against each other, and so things that generate higher costs and higher fares will be sorted out in the marketplace. And if you want to set standards, you need to think about what those standards should be, because those who are actually implementing lower standards have lower costs may drive out others in that process. So you have to be both concrete in thinking about what's in front of you and imaginative in thinking about kind of more broadly how the situation is going to evolve. So this is the report I released. I'm going to go through the recommendations in 5 key areas. And I'll do this pretty quickly, and we can come back to any of these that you want to as we have Q&A. First, the issue of level playing field. My main recommendations is the taxis should come under a 2-tiered regulatory structure that distinguishes between dispatch trips, which should have basically the same level of regulation as TNCs, and flag trips, which should have a much more intensive level of regulation that applies, that protects against oversupply, overcharging, and other abuses. In terms of drivers, I've called this, the big issue here is fingerprint-based criminal record checks, which the TNCs have fiercely resisted. And only a couple of cities, New York and Houston, and now Austin, have required. And in some cases, TNCs have withdrawn, in some cases not. So my recommendation on this is to maintain the full fingerprint-based checks. I also think that there is a better, in order both to protect public safety and in order to create a level playing field with taxis, which generally have these checks done for their drivers. For the obvious reason in terms of level playing field and public safety, and then also to develop and move toward not just these sort of backward-looking, what have you done in the past checks, which have some predictive value as to the risk going forward, but active risks safety management of drivers, similar to what you see in many fleets, which have a lot of feedback, a lot of monitoring, training, all integrated in a really sophisticated fleet-specific way, so that the companies are responsible for minimizing risk, not just for sort of criminal activity or bad, unsafe driving, but also integrated with that is customer service. I think this is really important not just for the current industry, but also as you see others starting to look to enter. For wheelchairs, as I said, there's been a number of programs around the city to, especially in the largest cities, to require a certain number of wheelchair accessible vehicles, to set up a dispatch service, to require drivers to pick up trips, to provide subsidies, to have a fee on all taxi trips that underwrites the subsidy. And I think of this as a kit of parts. Like, we'll mandate all these separate things, and then we'll think we'll have good service. And I think the record shows you don't, because for good service, you need somebody in charge, which is a dispatch company, that can actively manage and has authority over the drivers. And any good dispatch operation that I've seen around the country integrates the drivers into their operation in a way that the kit of parts does not. And I think it's a fool's errand to require all drivers to do this or that, or all vehicles to do this or that. We're talking about a quite small number of trips that need some good service, but every taxi driver I've talked to who provides wheelchair accessible service, you ask them why, kind of, how did you get into this and why are you doing this? And there's always a story that leads them to be motivated to want to provide this service. You have to want it. And wanting it is not something that you can deal with by regulation. So I would switch gears here quite dramatically and say, have subsidies plus have the trip served by dispatch companies that have drivers completely integrated into their operation and are committed to providing the service. And there's a lot of companies like that around the country, mainly providing non-emergency medical service and senior services and the like, and aggregate those trips and serve them. On the driver-employee status, and the question here is often pegged as, should drivers be independent contractors, as they're considered now by the companies, or treated as employees? I think the either-or aspect to that question is what gets us off track here. That drivers should certainly have civil rights protections, which are not don't have particular economic implications or cost implications, and then benefits that are provided either by law or through negotiation. So that the law should either mandate that certain benefits be provided, particularly to full-time drivers, or there should be means for drivers to negotiate them. And at the same time, one reason that the companies, the TNCs, like taxi companies, want to keep their drivers as independent contractors so they don't have to take on those costs, so they don't do certain things. The TNCs are actually much more manage the drivers than taxis do, than taxi fleets have. Taxi fleets have always avoided doing too much because then they're concerned that the drivers will be, through lawsuit, will be deemed to be employees. So I think the law should say certain things, the companies can exercise certain controls on drivers as part of the bargain, as part of the package here, aimed toward managing the service and being accountable and providing good quality service. And then finally, in terms of state or local regulation, which has been a big issue around the country, and particularly here, California led the way in being the first state to regulate TNCs at the state level. There was a bill that was vetoed by the governor a couple of weeks ago that would have moved, that included, it's a convoluted thing, but basically included reorganizing TNC regulation, which is currently with the California PUC, and transferring certain parts of it to DMV and the State Highway Patrol. That's on the TNC side. But legislation then would have envisioned doing that, plus moving taxi regulation from cities, where it is now, to the state. And this was passed on the last day of August and then vetoed by the governor a couple weeks ago. So my recommendation here is twofold, really. First is the taxis and TNCs should be regulated by the same entity, whoever that might be. Because the biggest challenge here, and this is really where you go back and you say, what's the most important thing? So the most important thing is to have consistent regulation across the for-hire sector. you'll get it two ways. You'll either do it yourself or it will happen on its own, because the taxis are disadvantaged in the competition because of overly restrictive regulation. They'll just end up going away, and you'll just have T&C. So you'll get it one way or the other. It's better if you do it yourself up front. So they should be under the same roof. And then when you have a heavy flag market, they should be at a local or at least regional level. That it's a job that you need to have that sort of local presence and strength and understand the connections with other agencies and with the community stakeholders that is very difficult for state agencies to do. And in fact, with taxi regulation, even when the state regulates it, they do so, like in Nevada, they create an agency for Clark County, which includes Las Vegas. In Maryland, they have carve-outs for Baltimore and the counties in suburban DC. So you don't really have statewide taxi regulation in any place with a large flag market anyway. And the idea that the state could regulate taxis statewide in California, frankly, boggles my mind. Dispatch markets, when it's just dispatch, it's a much simpler thing, and that can really be done at a state or local level. Finally, on the planning side, just a couple of points here. One is there's a real lack of data in terms of trip making, in terms of fleet sizes, in terms of how these industries operate. And as private competing companies, Uber and Lyft have been very protective of their data. And I think what there needs to be is, by the regulator, mandates to get the same type of trip data from everybody, and proper provisions for anonymizing data and confidentiality, but we need to see what the picture is. In transportation planning, we should be incorporating the changes in travel time and costs that are likely to come about, particularly with autonomous vehicles, which have huge ramifications for how the transportation system works and for land use, into travel demand modeling. Policy should prioritize the higher efficiency vehicles, so shared rides, microtransit, and that sort of thing. And I think this is an excellent opportunity to begin to price the use of road space, something I worked on quite extensively in New York. And as we're at a turning point in who's providing these services, we should be pricing into the service the externalities, primarily use of road space as well as emissions. So that is my presentation this morning. I thank you for your attention, and I am happy to see we've got a good amount of time for questions. Who would like to go first? Right. So there's been a lot of interest in taking the mandates on taxis and applying them to T&Cs. It's gotten basically nowhere. The T&Cs say, hey, it's not our business model, right? We're the new sexy different thing. And our business model is we don't own any vehicles. We don't operate any vehicles. They used to say they're not a transportation company, and it's not clear to me. And I've seen quotes in newspapers around the country with T&C managers saying that. I'm not sure it's really their position now or not. They clearly are, and they act like transportation companies in so many ways. But they're saying basically it's not something we can do. And then they've been doing some things to try and fill that gap. So in New York and Boston, or Chicago, for example, there are accessible taxicabs, and there's some of them use Uber and will answer calls through Uber. The app has that option. And then they've been sort of working with trying to get some accessible vehicles into their fleet. But it's hard to tell if there's much more than some warm words being said here, and certainly nothing to scale. I think this is an issue so my solution, so that's what's happening. My solution is not to require anyone, but to have companies that provide that service that's underwritten by a surcharge on all the fares. And then let those who want to serve that market. I think it's much better to have a market, have it be attractive to serve, have drivers and companies come to serve that, have competition within that, than to try and force this on anyone. I think it's kind of of a will be a very long battle, as it has been taxi cabs, that is of uncertain outcome anyway. Oh, sure. I'll repeat the question. So that was a question about what the TNCs have done for wheelchair accessible service.
Of the 12 persons people we put forward, the first use of political people, that
so if you read the report, so the question is, sorry, see, short-term memory loss, not to mention long-term. So the question is, which of the policy recommendations are, do you say implementable or adoptable? Like feasible. So do you mean that the appropriate authorities might adopt them? Yeah, okay. And then I think they're implementable in the sense that they're practicable. I think they're designed to be policies that some state and cities would adopt, would seriously consider and adopt. I've done a lot of work around the country on the taxi side over a number of years, so I have a good sense of how things sell. And there are examples. If you have a time to go through the report, you'll see examples of each of the things that I talk about as recommendations have been done someplace in some fashion. And sometimes I'm taking this from over here and this from over here and putting them together and that kind of thing. But they're not dropping out of the sky from Mars as a wholly new idea. They're new to some of these discussions, but they've been done and they've been shown that they can be effective. And having testified in front of city councils around the country, one question one always gets asked is, what do our peer cities do? And they want to know, A, are they missing the boat? B, has someone had good experience with this? They want reassurance that we're not just blindly going down some new path that has a cliff at the end of it. And so it's really important to provide examples of how this has worked, and all of these have. And I think the way the politics are now, some of these are very difficult, like the fingerprint checks. But I think they've been done, they could be done, they need a push, but they're not too much of a reach. And that's, from a public policy standpoint, that's where I try and be like a push, but not too much of a reach. If it doesn't need a push, it doesn't need me. If it's too much of a reach, don't go there.
One issue that I often think about is the pretty not insignificant smartphones, and how is this an issue that you think that you are able to fix, or what and how do you just to
Right, very good question. So the question is, how can we bridge the gap with people who don't smartphones or banking relationships and the like, and don't end up with two different, with those in and those out. So here I'm a little bit more optimistic than my comments about wheelchair accessibility in TNC. So there have been a number of small-scale things being done, often with specialized populations like seniors or disabled people, where the TNCs are starting to be able to serve people. So you have to sort of dissect each of these elements. So if you think about the use of a smartphone, it's possible you could use text messaging, and which virtually everyone has a cell phone. You use text messaging, that's one potential. Secondly, there's lots of call centers around. So if there's a social service agency that wants to use Lyft and they use their call center and then dispatch it from that type of thing is an option. And it's a little bit pasted together, but it could work and it could get you further down the road. And then in terms of banking relationships, there's lots of technological solutions that basically revolve around having a prepaid card. And so I think that these are all solvable with effort, and that and you can kind of chip away at them. And also, a good deal of it will be solved just as the technology expands. There was a hand here, yeah.
I have two questions. My first one is about the driver. So you kind of set these things, some recommendations would be to have like benefits and stimulus for employers, but we just have to have like sort of like drawbacks or negatives for the drivers who are sort of being the independent contractors, but at the same time, they want their rights and they want insurance, for example, driven by the company, but also they like to have the feeling of like a flexible schedule because some of these women actually have to do the full time, they have to have full understand flexible things. And then my second question is regarding AV vehicles, or when you can, I want to hear your opinion on regulation and how, I guess, how that should be seen as today, should be more regulated, should be clear, or how much should be seen.
Okay, good. So the first question was about drivers and independent contractor versus employee. The drivers, and you correctly point out, drivers want some of both. They want some from column A and some from column B. And any driver you talk to will talk about having the flexibility to work when they want. So being an employee doesn't mean you don't have the flexibility to work when you want. That's an employer's decision, whether you have set schedules or not. So much of the independence and flexibility that comes with the job, taxi drivers were employees for a long time, and there was, in some cases yes, in some cases not, but there could very much be flexibility in working hours. So I think you can maintain the flexibility. You can judiciously choose whether you want to mandate some of these rights and privileges or leave them to negotiation. I think much of it should be left to negotiation, aside from civil rights protections. And I think much of it should depend on full-time versus part-time. So one of the things you hear from the TNCs is that the vast majority of their drivers work part-time. And you have this image of people going out on Friday nights. And actually, I didn't mention it, but it's a really important part of their business model is that they adjust supply to meet the peak in demand in a way that is far more effective than has been the case with taxis. So you want to maintain that. But I got some numbers from Uber that show that the majority of their service is provided either by drivers working full-time or at least half-time. So from the driver's standpoint, there's this tail of people who work a little bit, but it's not much of the service, just inherently. And if you get in a cab, if you get in an Uber vehicle, chances are more than 50-50 that driver works at least half-time. And that those are the drivers, personally, I think, are most concerned in terms of the side benefits, employee benefits. And so I think all this needs to be tailored, which is why I think a lot of it should be the subject of negotiation, and drivers and the companies can say what they want and you can work through that. On autonomous vehicles, your question was what? Just restate your question. Oh, and how they should be regulated. Right. So how much regulation, how much freedom, quote unquote, for autonomous vehicles? So as you may know, there's two visions of autonomous vehicles. There's the Google vision that they'll be fully autonomous, no steering wheel, no gas pedal. And Google concluded that the hard part of the problem is the handoff between being autonomous and being the driver being involved. Everybody else is working on adding features. And it's clear that over the next, say, 5 years, the time frame people have been optimistically talking about, that you'll just see more and more features added. And I think that's very good. I'll come to the regulation in a minute, but you have to sort of like, what are you regulating? Get your arms around the idea of some concept of what you're regulating. So what I think will be regulated is this adding features. And the features so what are the issues that raises? Well, one issue is the human factors So we saw in the Tesla accident, fatality in Florida, someone who's very tech savvy was showing off what he didn't need to, that the features were working and then they didn't. So I think there's a lot, there's the highway fatalities have been rising quite dramatically in the last couple of years, and there's numbers that have just come out recently. And much of this is likely due to distracted driving, although no one knows. And so you give people more and more of these features, and you really get more and more of these sorts of problems. That's something we really need to know. And we don't really know how well the technology works and which range is. So if you drive around Mountain View, someone was telling me the other day, well, Google has all this millions of miles of experience driving around Mountain View. And I'm like, well, Mountain View ain't Pittsburgh. And I'll also tell you, Pittsburgh isn't New York or LA. And so there are a lot of issues with the core issue here with autonomous vehicles is that you can program a machine to deal with this set of known events, but you will have unknown events occur, or constellations of events, known events that come together. If you look at the history of airplane crashes, airplanes don't crash for a reason. They crash. They don't crash when it's dark. They don't crash when it's raining. They don't crash when the pilot is tired. They crash when those things come together in some fashion. And that's what you'll see. And so there'll be these unanticipated sorts of situations. And so we need to know how well the technology works, and that will be based on experience. New York City Transit, buy new subway cars, which I was involved in, and you get a train set of 10 cars they need to run, I think it's 90 days without a breakdown. That's the acceptance testing. So that's how I think acceptance testing works with this. Run so many miles without a problem. And if you have a problem on day 89, you go, you fix it, and then you come back and you do 90 days starting from zero up. And so there's a lot of that. So that whole process needs to be overseen from a government standpoint. That's one regulatory role. And there needs to be transparency for the people at risk, which includes both people in the vehicles and people not in the vehicles, which is where the pushback is going to come from on autonomous vehicles. It's not when I voluntarily get in an Uber, but when Uber runs over my kid, that's who you're going to see. And you can talk all you want about the number of lives that this technology will save, but the people who will be in the headlines are the ones who were killed by the technology. There's always a problem with safety programs, is that you save statistical lives, not real people. Nobody knows that they were saved by this. So the length of my answer is in complete disproportion to the content, because we're still trying to figure this out, and I'm sort of talking through it. So those are the elements. So you sort of think about how this evolves, you think about what the risks are, you think about the things you don't know, you think about things you need to learn, and so there needs to be transparency and oversight on this. At the same time, I think there needs to be a lot of flexibility given to the manufacturers and developers of this to pursue different strategies, because we don't know what's going to work ultimately. But we just want to avoid two things. One is we don't want to kill more people than necessary. And the second is we don't want the bad things that happen to so undermine the development of the technology that you set it back. And I think that the tech industry is totally undervaluing the importance of those two observations. The air train at JFK, when it was being tested, one day they didn't put the sandbags in right to simulate the weight of the passengers. And it crashed and killed the operator. And it took a year before they resumed construction. So that's the kind of risk tolerance that you can run into here. When they built the Hoover Dam, they were killing people every day and kept going. Well, that's not the society we live in today, and I don't think it should be. When the automobile was invented, if you've read, what's his name? Well, Peter Norton's book, had tremendous fatality rates associated with it. So those are the things that need to be taken. So we sort of need to keep control of the process from a regulatory standpoint to guard against that. So now I'm going to stop the answer because I think I said probably more than I even can. Yeah, in the back. Right. Okay, good. So, okay, good. So the question is, the cab industry was growing before TNCs. Is regulation really so much of a damper on competing with Uber and Lyft? Or maybe regulations on the TNCs should be raised rather than reduce them on taxis. The growth shows that the regulations weren't so onerous you couldn't grow. On the other hand, there are clear disparities in regulatory constraint for dispatch taxi service as opposed to the TNCs. So that's what I would relax. And particularly in terms of the services provided and the fares charged. In some respects, I do think that the regulation on TNCs needs to be made more like taxis. Fingerprinting is the best example there. Mandates for wheelchair accessible service, although I would do it in a different way than generally has been done. But those are specific instances. In general, I think that there's a lot of room to kind of relax on the taxi side. Do we have web questions or webinar questions? Okay. Yes. Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so the question is about standards for TNC vehicles in terms of emissions and gas mileage. So I believe that CPUC could mandate certain model years. They could mandate certain fuel efficiency or emissions standards. I think, I'm not sure of that. It's certainly been done on the taxi side. LA is a really good example. A number of California cities have done so, and there's a lot of CNG taxis, for example. So you could do it by mandate. You could do it by subsidy. You could do it through pricing. You could institute charges on less efficient, more polluting vehicles. I think that my own view of this is that whatever you're doing, these are broad goals, and they should include broad classes of vehicles. So it's been relatively easy to single out taxis as having to do X, Y, and Z. And that's fine as far as it goes, but I think that that from a public policy standpoint, it makes more sense to cast the net more broadly than has sometimes been done. And certainly today, you need to cast the net over the whole for-hire industry. Otherwise, you introduce further disparities in their cost structure. And so I would look toward the more general vehicle standards, emission standards, and the like, cutting across. There's huge incentives for drivers to use fuel-efficient vehicles, given that you save money on gas, although, of course, as gas prices have been lower lately, there's less incentive there. So just my general approach to this should be to think about vehicles being used in commercial operation in one respect or another, and to look to raise those standards, or the whole vehicle fleet, although that has a lot of other issues, which certainly California has done, but that also raises a lot of other issues that go well beyond this subject. You asked the question, right? And anybody else? I'm happy to come back to you if I want to. Oh, you didn't? Okay. Someone sitting close to you did. Please. So the question is whether TNCs or for-hire generally should require a certain percentage of shared rides. They're moving in that direction. They should be encouraged, and there are ways from a public policy standpoint to encourage that and facilitate that. But I think it's something that needs to be grown as part of the business as opposed to a mandate. So I'll give you an example. I worked on a study that came out last month looking at transit agencies partnering with emerging mobility providers, so TNCs, car share, bike share. And where the most progress in this has been made, and it's been slow going, but the most progress has been made when agencies use their assets, like parking, in a mutually beneficial way. So Metro in DC has a contract with Enterprise for Enterprise car share. The car share operation at Enterprise, I think it's 40 DC Metro lots in suburban stations to have car share there. So Metro has the parking that Enterprise needs. Enterprise is complementing transit, first mile, last mile kinds of trips. And as part of that, Metro was able to say, we want these 40, some of which will be high volume, but some of which provide important access from an equity and service standpoint that might not be the most profitable. So it's a nice way to have mutual benefit, something that's fairly easily done, using the agency's assets, and is imbued with public policy goals as well as commercial goals. And so for things like shared ride, you can imagine, for example, if people have an Uber commute trip to either downtown or to a transit station, to give parking priority to those vehicles, right, and that kind of thing, as an incentive and also as a marketing thing that kind of you get something special for doing this, as opposed to a mandate. Other questions?